Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to my talk. I'm Nikos Ntoumanis, and I'm based at the School of Psychology at Curtin University, which is in Western Australia, in Perth. What I'm going to talk to today is about a new conceptualization and testing of the social context from an SDT perspective. How all this started was many years ago. When I was working at the University of Birmingham, I supervised a PhD student, Kim Bartholomew, and we made the case in the SDT literature that it's important to measure both the bright and the dark side. So that was, although in the DC and Ryan writings there was a lot of talk about the bright and the dark side, no one had measured so at that point in time. So we proposed and tested a dual model, which was tested in sport, but a lot of labs afterwards adopted this model, and the work was replicated across a wide variety of domains. But in terms of the social context, the bright and the dark side have coexisted and measured for a number of years, starting with the original work on autonomy support and controlling environments. But in my intervention work, I've come across a third style, which I provisionally call a need-indifferent style. I've come across a lot of people who are neither nasty, but at the same time they're not need-supportive in communicating with others. They just go with emotions. And they don't really, their communication is motivationally empty. So again, with a different PhD student at Curtin University, we're starting the same route in terms of conceptualizing and testing perhaps a third class of behaviors that sit in between need-supportive and need-thwarting behaviors, and we provide some preliminary evidence for the existence of these behaviors. And we hope that researchers in other domains might want to test this new conceptualization and measurement. So I'm based at the Physical Activity and Wellbeing Lab, and this is our website. Perth is a very beautiful city. If any of you would like to visit us, you're very welcome. Feel free to email me. So, as I mentioned earlier, lots of research has looked at the support and the thwarting of the needs, but not so much the middle class of behaviors that sit between these two. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about two studies that describe the development, the validation of two instruments, a self-report and an observational scale, tested in sport and exercise settings that aim to capture not just the need-supportive and need-thwarting elements, but also need-indifferent behaviors. And I'll make the case that tripartite conceptualization and measurement of interpersonal styles can help advance conceptually SDT, but also it will have a lot of practical implications for applied work. And this is really where the idea came from, interacting with fitness instructors, coaches, and teachers. So for those of you who like Whitney Houston, you probably come across this song, The Greatest Love of All. She beautifully sang about being in an environment that was not able to fulfill her needs. So is there a need-indifferent environment? Can someone be in an environment that is neither thwarting nor supportive? And can we measure it? So I make the case today that existing conceptualizations and measures of interpersonal behaviors do not distinguish between two types of dark sides. One that is very actively thwarting needs. So, for example, by a coach intimidating athletes. And a more neutral, passive style that is still negative, but it's actually not as maladaptive. Is someone who's been unresponsive to athlete's opinion, is a coach who keeps himself to himself and doesn't want to make an effort to really relate with his athletes. I'll give you two examples from the SDT literature where I'll make the case that behaviors which have been classified as thwarting perhaps will fit better under indifferent behaviors. One example is chaos. Chaos is often measured in the parenting literature and often refers to a style that is permissive without adequate structure and supervision. And it's often been labeled as a type of competence thwarting. While admittedly, being in a chaotic environment doesn't help someone to achieve their goals, perhaps, it's not really an environment which actively blocks one's needs. A better example of competence thwarting environment would be an environment where, for example, in sport, a coach would publicly humiliate one of his players for not performing well. Another example is of behaviors which sometimes are called cold, or the different names. Someone is cold when they're distant from others and unavailable or disinterested in others. And it's often used as an example of relatedness thwarting. And again, while someone could in theory be cold and distant from others because they are hostile or because they use conditional regard, and these are indeed examples of need thwarting behaviors, at the same time, someone could just be distant from others just because they are reserved or because they are wary of talking to others, so they just like to keep themselves to themselves. So you can't really always classify these behaviors as being thwarting. So there have been some attempts to measure the middle class of behaviors in the literature, somewhat limited, and usually they call these behaviors as neutral, but there hasn't been any effort to explain and define conceptually what these behaviors mean and how they relate to psychological needs and important outcomes. So we propose that need-different behaviors are demonstrated when a coach or a significant other, more generally, is inattentive to the psychological needs of people they interact with. And I make a case that this distinction between indifferent and thwarting behaviors is important because the indifferent behaviors actually might relate less strongly to athlete need frustration. And because they might relate to less strongly to athlete need frustration, they might predict less deleterious or dark outcomes. For example, they might predict in the context of sport feelings of boredom or inability to concentrate, people drifting away their attention, but less likely to predict outcomes such as, for example, someone feeling debilitative anxiety, which would be the case in a need-thwarting environment. And from an applied perspective, need-thwarting behaviors represent missed opportunities for need support. So in terms of how this might look like for autonomy, someone who's autonomy indifferent could be someone who's actually not really interested in understanding others' perspectives and wants and preferences. A competence indifferent coach would be someone who is chaotic, who actually gives all athletes the same tasks without varying the levels of ability to match his or her athlete's needs. Or someone who keeps, says a female coach, keeps herself to herself and is inattentive to the quality of the relationship between herself and her athletes. So we embarked in a 3-study paper through a PhD student of mine, Nikita Bashar, to measure the needed different behaviors alongside supportive and thwarting behaviors. And we reference this in relation to the coach, because the coach, without a doubt, is the most significant other in the context of sport. So we aim to develop and provide evidence for a new measure of others' perceptions of coaches, supportive, thwarting, and indifferent behaviors. So I'll go briefly through what we did. In the first study, we created a pool of items. We provided evidence for phase and content validity. In the second study, we tested the new scale using a number of different factorial approaches. In the third study, we retested the factorial structure with a new independent sample and provided evidence for nomological validity. So in study one, what we did is we started with very large pool of items from existing measures, observational and self-report measures. We deleted duplicates or items that were very similar to each other, or items that were not appropriate for self-report measures. And we ended up with a list of supportive, thwarting, and indifferent behaviors. Obviously, these indifferent behaviors were not proposed as such by those who developed the original scales, but we classify them as being indifferent on the basis of our conceptualization of indifferent behaviors. And then in addition to these 7 items, we wrote some new items which tapped what we perceive to be indifferent behaviors. And we got a group of athletes, we interviewed them, we gave them a small questionnaire when we asked them to rate the clarity of the items and whether they were appropriate for sport, whether they matched their experiences, and we asked them for suggestions for new items. We also asked a panel of experts from SDT, some of you are in this room, to rate these items in terms of clarity, appropriateness, whether they targeted the intended factor, whether they might target unintended factors, and we asked them for suggestions for new items. And using the experts' ratings, we created the content validity index for each item, and for the vast majority of items, the CVI was acceptable. And then based on this round of reviews, we made some minor modifications to the items, and we wrote some additional ones. And then we went to phase 2, study 2, where we had the new scale, and we used a number of different factorial models to test the factor structure of this model. We used confirmatory factor analysis, but also exploratory structural question modeling, a bifactor SM and bifactor CFA. We tested in total 12 models, and we looked at the reliability and discriminant validity of the new scale. So in the second study, we tested a number of models. We tested models with overarching factors, need support, thwarting, indifferent behaviors. But we also tested need-specific dimensions within the overarching factors. So we also tested non-factor solutions, 3-factor solutions, and also 1-factor solutions. To cut a very, very long story short, we ended up with a 3-factor exploratory structural question model which had acceptable fit, significant factor loadings, and low cross loadings. And as you can see from the diagonal, here it had acceptable internal reliability indices and discriminant validity. These are the factor correlations which are pure of measurement error and therefore are higher than standard correlations. And these are some of the items in the scale. As you can see, there is a fairly good spread of autonomy, competence, and relatedness items within each of the 3 factors. The scale is available, and the whole actually paper is available on Open Science Framework. I'm happy to give you the link. So in the third study, what we did is we wanted to replicate the factor structure of the new questionnaire and provide evidence for nomenological validity. So we used this scale, the new scale, alongside other existing scales that measure motivation-related variables. So the good news was that the 3-factor model we found in study 2 was replicated in study 3 with very similar fit, a very similar pattern of loadings and internal reliabilities. And the other piece of good news was that none of the other factors, none of the other 11 models we tested in study 2 were supported in study 3. Hence, the 3-factor essay model was replicated well in both studies. Now, the evidence for nomenological validity was somewhat mixed. As we expected, dedication and commitment in sport was predicted only by need support, and irrelevant thoughts and lack of concentration was predicted only by needed difference. But in terms of exhaustion, we expected to be predicted mainly by need thwarting. We found that needed difference behaviors also predicted exhaustion. We don't have any strong rationale to explain this finding. I mean, potentially it could be that if you're really a high achiever and you're with us were the athletes in our sample, and you're with a needed different coach, perhaps you have to make quite a lot of decisions about yourself in terms of training, and if you haven't got the experience, you might end up overtraining, not taking adequate rest, and therefore feel exhausted. But of course, this is just a hypothesis. We also looked at how the social environment predicts the 3 needs. As expected, the satisfaction of the needs were exclusively predicted by need support. There were no paths from thwarting on the different behaviors. And also, as expected, the autonomy and competence frustration were more strongly predicted by thwarting than by needed different behaviors. Unexpectedly, relatedness frustration was actually better predicted by needed difference behaviors than by need thwarting. So this is a finding that we didn't expect, but I think we have a rationale for this. When you look at the items from this scale, they really tap in different behaviors. Like, for example, there's an item that says that I feel that the others, I feel I have superficial relations with others. So, to the extent, so it is possible that this scale actually might need some modification. Of course, I'm not saying that it could be a problem with our questionnaire, of course, but we need to further test this relation with new samples. So is there a room for needed different behaviors? Well, there was good evidence for dimensionality, reliability, discriminant validity of the scale, with a relatively good balance of need-specific behaviors. In terms of nomenological network of constructs, we have found a lot of relations which were in the expected direction, but there were a couple of unexpected results, which could be because of our scale, or it could be because of the criterion validation scales that we used, and therefore maybe we need to do further work with other scales. Or maybe we need to further modify our scale, of course. So another issue is why 3 factors and not 9 factors? This is something we debated a lot when we wrote this paper. We did not dismiss the utility of 9-factor solutions, and I think these are particularly important, measuring the 9 factors when you do experimental work in the lab or in the field, when you want to isolate the independent effects of each of the 9 components of the social environment. However, I believe that our 3-factor solution is parsimonious and useful, and it's in line with theory. A lot of recent work by DC and Ryan that referred to need support and need thwarting, to the overarching dimensions. Actually, it's in line with a lot of work. I contacted some of the authors of these scales who had unidimensional solutions, and they told me that they did try to have multidimensional measures, but they couldn't find the evidence for discriminant validity. And I think this parsimonious measure has some practical utility when one is interested in the social context, but also in other variables, and they want to test a complex pattern of relations. So this model could be a good compromise, measuring fairly accurately and in a parsimonious way the social context. And I'm running out of time, but I don't have that many more slides. Just want to talk about one more study we did trying to develop a similar measure in the exercise context. We're approached by a big fitness international company, Les Mills International, and they asked us to do a study with their instructors. So we did an intervention study in the context of which we developed a new scale that measured indifferent behaviors. And the idea came from looking at these instructors before we did the intervention. We noticed that a lot of the things they were doing and saying, they were neither thwarting or supportive. They were actually motivationally empty, as I call them. Phrases such as keep pushing or go, go, go were used repeatedly. But unless these kind of phrases are directed towards a particular goal, are given with warmth, and are related to some sort of feedback, they're unlikely to actually to have an impact on the three needs. So we made the case in that paper that needed different behaviors represent missed opportunities for need support and should be targeted in intervention work. And in fact, if they're not addressed, may undermine attempts to make the social environment more need supportive because they add noise and that dilute the intervention message. So we created a scale to measure these behaviors, and we used blind counters, and that was a sample of exercise instructors. We filmed them before the intervention, and 12 weeks later, at the end of the intervention, for those of you who are interested in the results of the intervention, they were published. This paper was published in 2017. I'm happy to refer you after my talk to the paper, but I'm only presenting here the results of the scale. So we wrote some items that they're a little bit different from the self-report measure because they are for observers and they refer to an exercise class, but conceptually they tap behaviors which are supportive, thwarting, any different in an exercise context. We found good ICCs for all behaviors, and we were able to show that our intervention not only decreased thwarting behaviors, but also had an impact on needed different behaviors. They also decreased, and need supportive behaviors increased. So we have a scale which was sensitive to pick up changes across all three styles of communication. Okay, very briefly, in terms of future work, I think what is missing, and if I have the chance to do this again, we need some qualitative work, particularly think aloud protocols, to sit down with athletes or students in classes to ask them to think about what criteria they use to perceive a significant other as indifferent, thwarting, and supportive. And I think this work will provide richer data to support or not the distinction between these three styles. I think it's also important to examine the antecedents of the three classes of behaviors. There have been fair few reviews looking at the antecedents of supportive and thwarting behaviors. Of course, there might be a case to look at the antecedents of indifferent behaviors. Perhaps someone is indifferent to others' needs if they're more attentive to their own needs and goals. It could be some personality variables that could, like if someone is introvert, I might predict a needed different behavior. Perhaps we need to think of other analytical methods. Perhaps they could do a better job in terms of teasing out the 9 dimensions. And I think it's also important to test the applicability and the replication of these findings to other life domains, because I don't know if you watch Matilda. This is Miss Trunchbull. Not everyone behaves like her, right? So I think it is important for researchers to look at teachers, look at work supervisors, look at fitness instructors and coaches, and look at how they behave, what they say, what they're not saying, they should be saying, and how they can change that so that the interventions from an SDT perspective not only try to make these significant others less thwarting and more supportive, but also less indifferent. Thank you. I would like to thank my collaborators for these two projects, and thank you for coming to my talk.